Do you believe in life after love? I can feel something inside me say, I really don't think you're strong enough now.
Right.
Do you
We should
believe
just
in life after love?
not listen to this whole beautiful
I can feel
melody.
something.
All right, we don't have to go through the whole thing.
Yeah.
Welcome, everybody. We're so excited that you're here. And for the discussion today, we'll start with brief introductions and then we can jump right in. So, Mark, do you want to introduce a couple people first?
Yes. Okay. So Hannah Ahlblad, wait, say hello. Where are you? Somewhere in the ether here. Hannah studied at MIT's Media Lab in the School of Architecture Planning, and also sort of majored something in economics, and received an MArch from University of Texas at Austin. She's worked at Stephen Hall Architects and 10 Architectos on projects for NASA, which is what? That's cool. And a library in Malawi and residential projects in Finland. Prior to architecture, she worked on curatorial teams at the Harvard Art Museums and the Museo de Arte de Ponce, if I'm saying that right. And then we have Isidoro Michan-Guindi, Isi, as I know him, received his B.Arch from Cornell University and an M.Arch too from Princeton. He's currently working on his own office in Mexico City. Is it under your own name, or do you have a different name?
No, under my name.
Under your name, okay. And has previously worked at Taller de Arquitectura in Mexico City and Moss Architects in New York. So Issy and I went to school together, and Hannah and I actually met at a mutual friend's wedding. And have been Instagram friends and following each other's work since. So I'm very happy to have you both here, and it's been a while, so it's great to see you.
Thanks, and nice to meet you both. I want to introduce first Nikki Chang. She is the head of design and strategy at Junzi Kitchen, a fast casual Northern Chinese restaurant that started at Yale and now has several locations around New York City. And this year they have been doing some great work for essential workers in the city. She is a Shanghai native. She got a master's at Yale in architecture and worked at prominent offices, including SOM. And her interests are architecture, interior design, culinary arts. So she brings all of that magic to Junzi and to other projects that she does. Also want to introduce Beatrice Lozano. Beatrice grew up in the suburbs of Michigan. She is a designer at the creative studio Sunday Afternoon, and an immigrant rights activist. Beatrice holds a BFA from the University of Michigan. I follow her work very closely because it brings the most contemporary explorations, experimentations in custom type, coding, and motion design to the work of activism. So there's some really avant-garde graphic design work that Beatrice has been doing. And I think that it's creating a new language and visual culture to think about not just survival, but hope and thriving as far as immigrant communities are concerned. And then welcoming back Pulane Mpotokwane, who is the founder of Botala Design, a sustainable design consultancy based in Botswana and South Africa. She has previously worked at Arup in different fields of expertise, including sustainability consulting, urban design, and project planning and building retrofit. Pulane and I were undergrads at Princeton, and after that she studied more architecture at the AA in London. And we've recently talked about elitism in architecture and how institutions such as museums can enhance or ameliorate colonial inequalities. And last but not least, of course, Philip Poon. Philip grew up in New York, in Brooklyn and Westchester. He did his undergrad at Rice and at Columbia, and got a master's in architecture from Harvard. Philip worked at OMA, and we met as interns in Rotterdam, and he's also worked at Sana and for Christian Carrots. And in the last several years, Philip has cultivated a distinctive art and architecture practice here in New York City that critically and creatively looks at the American condition, and in particular the Asian American presence and identity in the US, including its architectural expression. So welcome, everybody.
Thank you.
Mark, are you muted?
Great. So it's good. It's good to have everybody. I think because we have so many guests, we'll jump in and kind of stick to the script, which I'm not good at. So just like slap my hands if I get too far off track. But I think just to briefly check in with everybody and see how, in a brief statement, how the last months have been, and any kind of initial thoughts you might want to throw out there. So should we go in the order that we introduced or something? Yeah, okay, so Hannah, start us off.
So how things are going? Is that I was trying to remember what order you guys introduced us in. I got distracted from the question.
Yeah. How are things going right now?
Things are good. I think before you were like, what are the two sentences you would use to describe? I think the two words would be like adventure and spooky. That's how this has been, I think. Exciting, but scary too.
Yeah, very surreal, I'd imagine. That's what, for me at least, has been. Okay, so should we go on to the next? Isi, how are you doing?
I think probably very similar to all of you, but it's been time to regenerate, and and having the space to and the different kind of space to work differently, in the situation that we all have. Yeah.
Everybody's adapting to these kind of crazy conditions. Okay, who is next? Was it Nikki?
I think for me it's a lot of change, but also a lot of hope. I sort of live in between two worlds. In China and here, both countries are sort of at the crosshair of what's going on right now. So on one hand, things are looking pretty dire for New York and the rest of the country, going through a lot of extreme volatilities. But if I look back at my friends and family in China, they're having like dinner parties, and no masks are no longer required in the public space. So I think collectively as humanity, we still have hope. Things can get better if we all do our parts. So yeah, it's very exciting to be in this position and have this like duality. So whenever one world is burning down, there's always hope somewhere else.
Beatrice?
Yeah, similar to everybody else, I think this has been a really like pivotal time to be reflective. At least for me, I was living in New York before, and because of the pandemic, I've relocated to California temporarily, which has given me more time with like family and just to slow down. But this whole thing has also given me the opportunity to connect virtually with a lot more people like we're doing now in ways that I wasn't doing beforehand.
Pulane?
Yeah, I agree with the ideas of reflection and regeneration. I think that's been a big part of a lot of designers' lives for the past few months. And in my case in particular, I think I've identified a lot of opportunities for sustainability and in design. And I think a lot of people are recognizing the importance of climate change mitigation, which is part of the work that I do and have done in the past. And I see people really starting to take that idea seriously now, which is good news for myself, and I assume all of us who work in that space. So like Nikki said, I think even though this is a strange, surreal time, I think there's a lot of opportunities out there. And I hope that our voices as designers can be heard more in the conversations, especially the political conversations that are being had at the moment. So yeah, I'm optimistic in general.
And Philip.
Yeah, I guess I can't tell if I've gone crazy or whether I'm also learning to adapt better. But maybe to build off of what Nikki said, it's interesting to me that, you know, China, which is a somewhat authoritarian government, has got this totally under control. It would be much better to live in China right now, where you can do anything you want, go to any restaurant, not, you know, not wear a mask. And communist China is totally crushing the greatest country in the whole world, blah, 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 at containing this virus. Like, there's this like reverse split. Even when kind of, maybe even building off of what Pulane just said, like, sure, China's government, you can't criticize it on Google, but at least you can like go outside and not, you know, be scared of catching a deadly virus.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. And one of the things we can begin to consider is like, what is the cost of that safety, right? And is the experience uniformly good for everybody in China? And I also want to be mindful of, you know, we are recording this conversation, so just want to mention that, you know, there are people whose families might be living in China, so we may not be able to speak as openly as we might want to. But that's all I can probably say, because I'm, you know, I know that my partner Andy has a connection, like his parents immigrated from Taiwan. But aside from that, like, I don't have standing to say very much more. So we'll move to the first question with that. And Mark, do you want to introduce that?
Okay, yeah. So for context, so the Great Wall was built for defense, but it sort of exists today as a tourist destination. And it's become so sort of like, you know, widely known through its kind of like imageability. So its image has been disseminated through commodities like postcards, books, souvenirs, you know, advertisements, and now today like social media posts. And the kind of, we sort of lose sight of what its initial construction was, what it meant, what it represented, because of the kind of like contemporary, you know, existence of the wall. And I guess we're kind of trying to speculate how the Trump wall exists. Like, do you think that it has this kind of like, I don't know, symbolic nature to it, that, or like kind of just like imageability or image quality? This is like this word is like, I've been studying for architecture exams, and like this is like a weird like architecture ARE licensure word, like image, like needing to be imageable or whatever that means. But basically, like, do you think because the Trump wall is like a glorified fence, like it has that kind of like same quality to like withstand, or like become a sort of like commodity outside of, you know, it's like its existence to keep people out, I guess. And this could go, anybody could kind of chime in on anything, any thoughts that are coming up.
I don't know, I feel I have such a strong reaction to this question in the context of what everything else is happening. Like, I feel if I speak first, it'll muffle a lot of other people's opinions. So please speak before me.
Whoever has the strongest opinions and is bursting to say something, just say it.
Oh gosh, I feel this like daily insult almost whenever people compare the Trump wall with the Great Wall, and it's like every morning you wake up to some like ridiculous things that he says, and like a bunch of experts have to come out and explain. I remember listening to like maybe the Wall Street Journal morning brief or whatever, and they like ask a economist, like a Nobel winning economist from Harvard to explain something that he just said. And the professor finally broke. He's like, you know, every time he says something crazy, we have to come out and explain to people what it means, even if it has no ground. So I feel this comparison between the Trump wall and the Great Wall in China, like brought me that sense of just like insult almost. Like, there's really there's so much difference between the two projects, both in terms of their intended purpose, the build quality, and the design intent, as well as the span and many dynasties that the project expanded in its lifetime over maybe a little bit more than 2,000 years. I think it started during about 200 BC during the Chunqiu and the warrior states period, and continued to go through Qing Dynasty, the first united dynasty in China, and throughout the history. So it becomes both a civil defense mechanism, an architecture project. A lot of the time it's also like really critically tied to the landscape. And over time, of course, over 2,000 years, if you're responsible for building this project, extending it, you're also responsible for historic restoration. So with all that's going on, and over time, the project become a, you may say, a symbol for a lot of every emperor and government leaders' propaganda as a part of iconography of like a united nation, and like, you know, this ideal of defending our borders. But it also become a worldly recognized heritage site. So with all that, you know, in one project and comparing it to the fence that is being built right now, I think we're missing the intent and purpose, and glorifying a project that's from the intent to build to the history it's going to span is going to be very, very different. Yes, yeah, I told you it's going to be a very strong opinion.
That's a really important point. I feel like what you said about, you know, the physical structure becoming a means of propaganda, but then also turning later on into a cultural heritage site reminds me of other walls around the world, like the Berlin Wall, which from becoming a site of political contest turns into a tourist destination. And, you know, it just speaks to how we could imagine possible futures where these highly charged geographies, hopefully in the future, are just, you know, people are just going there for tourism or something. Anybody else? Initial reactions?
I guess it's, I wonder if you guys know Ronald Rael's work with the kind of studying the border, and he made all these like postcards and snow globes and things that sort of play with this idea of the wall not being the most important part of the architecture, but the space kind of in between or on either side. I think in that way, it's kind of different from the Great Wall in China, because that is creating a space that people can walk on and like engage with physically. Whereas like, I don't know, for me personally, I feel like this wall is, I mean, it's a political statement and a gesture to certain, how do you say, like voters of Trump. But I don't think, you know, the first part of this wall between the US-Mexico border was built in 1989. So it's not like a new concept. I think the issues that are with the wall are more what's happening on either side, and like the detention camps and those kind of architectural languages. But someone can contradict me, but they have sort of different architectural meaning, I think, too. Yeah.
I think for me, I think it's interesting when people often give Trump so much credit for this wall, because when I think of the wall, I think of George W. Bush and like the Secure Borders Act, you know, all the xenophobia that happened after 9/11 and how this wall was physically built then. And now since Trump has been in power, it's like we haven't really seen you know, the wall grow. It really hasn't been built. There's no difference. I'm currently in San Diego, 15 minutes away from the border wall. I grew up spending a lot of time between here and Tijuana. Like, it looks exactly the same. It's not like Trump has like built, you know, this huge wall. It literally looks the same. I think in just a visual comparison, the Great Wall of China is architecturally impressive. It's like really large, really strong. And, you know, I see the border wall here all the time. It's really not even visually powerful. As to the many points you guys have mentioned, it is a glorified fence. Like, having it be see-through automatically just gives it this feeling that it's not even visually powerful. Like, I can barely run a mile, and yet when I see this border wall, I'm like, I think I can even, you know, get over this wall if I really wanted to. It's not like scary. It's not, it just, to me, it looks very sad. It just has a very, very different connotation of power.
I think, like, for example, I think in the Great Wall of China, what has happened is that there was like a weakening of the signifier, the literal function of the wall, whereas the signified, the concept of the wall got amplified. So for many different people, it had different meanings that go beyond the literal function of the wall. And in difference to the Trump wall, I think it has been heavily charged with different concepts. So for me, it's another story of wall. It's another, it's not only about the function of it, but it's somehow it's difficult to see a similar future because it's already has been charged with so many dilated signifiers that go beyond separating, go beyond border or perimeter. So yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I also feel we have to begin with the understanding of who's on either side of the wall and who is the wall for. To begin with, China at that time, even though it went through, so basically, if you think about the 5,000 years of documented history, there was a time where it's like everyone is their own boss and everyone is kind of, you know, claiming their own land. So there was constant war all the time, and then finally consolidated to this like tri-state, 3-state and like warrior states kind of stage, where there's like 3 or 5 strongest leaders of different states. And then the first united time of China was during the Qing Dynasty. The Qing Dynasty was also famous for massive advancements of industrial design. The emperor advanced to make sure that his army are unified and they were using the same swords and same arrows. So he standardized mass production of his military powers. So he's also standardized the units of measure, currency, and language. That was the beginning of the standardization. So the idea of the nation really as a country, as a united country, who's like Chinese, who's the outsider, was pretty much defined during that time. And every ruler since Qing Dynasty pretty much continued this ideology of the one nation and the us and them. So I would say since like maybe 2,000 years ago, there's this like generalized idea of who's us, like who's Chinese and what builds this nation, which is very different of what the becoming of America, right? Because if we, I mean, especially us living in New York, literally, you know, give me your poor and tired, and the US is built by immigrants. So the composition and the ideology of the nation, what is the idea of the nation, is literally defined differently. And then when you build a fence or a wall, you think about like who is it protecting and who is it fighting against from entrance. And in the event of the, you know, since the United Nations of China, the wall is pretty much idealized as the government as a symbol, and the Chinese people too, to feel safe from the invaders. So there's literally us and the invaders of them, where if you have a weakened border, you know, outsiders might come take your villagers, and there's a sense of danger, literally. But because there was no notion of the immigration built states, and there was no notion of diversity in a way, because there was such a strong recognition of the Chinese people since like that time. So I think it boils down to like what you believe in. If you know, we're talking about the context of the US and the border wall, if you believe in the us and them analogy, and that this nation is not built by people who constantly come here and build new lives and form new families, then this is the analogy Trump wants to symbolize for. But on the other hand, if we believe as people that this country is a place, is a safe and welcoming place for everyone who seek a new life, and we just can't have this kind of projects to continue to symbolize the opposite.
Yeah, I mean, I want to hear from Philip and from Pulane as well. Just a quick note, I mean, what I'm beginning to kind of see more clearly is that the Great Wall of China is a remnant of, you know, great wars being fought by, you know, these massive like groups who are already part of that land for many, many years. And so the trace of that is a very monumental space that the wall kind of, the architecture of the wall. Whereas here, the protection is from refugees, essentially, people coming to make a better life, to kind of live the American dream, which has been advertised, you know, throughout the world. And so the remnant of that is inherently not as grand, but a little bit shallow, I guess. Philip, any reactions?
Yeah, or maybe I preface by saying, of course, I'm a New York liberal, right? That's not, but I think to build off of what you just said and what Nikki said, like, I think what's missing is first the real discussion about what should happen to immigrants who are trying to cross the border illegally, right? And even more frightening is the idea that actually the border wall is not Trump as an individual being xenophobic and racist. It's actually the will of the American people, the 64 million people who voted for Trump, who want this wall, 50 plus million, however many million people. So it's a will of the people, actually. It's the will of the American people to build this wall, not my will, right? But then there's like the even bigger question about whether like all national boundaries should be more fluid and nationalism across the globe should be less important. And like, these are giant questions, right? And it's not, I think like when I've listened to podcasts about the wall, like it's not, I think most progressive liberals in New York City can recognize that the way it's handled is like horrific and like, you know, America should be better than this. But at the same time, what is the solution? Like, do progressive liberals in New York advocate for open borders, like, and kind of processes that don't have to play out? Look, I'm just being devil's advocate, right? I'm kind of articulating the conservative perspective, but also the reality that the wall is in many ways the result of American democracy and the quote unquote will of the people.
Yeah, one thing I found really interesting about the typology of the wall in the case of these two projects is that, you know, when construction on the Great Wall of China began, I think the people who built it were protecting themselves from cavalries, right? From people on foot and men on horseback, and I imagine carriages and things like that. And so a wall was an effective defense strategy, Whereas I read, I think it might have been on the Trump border wall Wikipedia page, which is very extensive and detailed. I read that actually the majority of illegal immigrants that are in the United States don't walk there via the southern border. They actually just overstay their existing visas, or they, they enter via airports or, by boats and things like that. And so I also sort of wonder, what is the effectiveness of a wall in 2020 as opposed to in, was it the 5th century BC? That the Chinese wall began being constructed. And so there's also this element of time that I think is not necessarily being explored. And I think what you said, Philip, about the idea of, nation building and examining borders and understanding what sort of like geopolitical structures do we want to create in this world? Are we wanting hard borders, or are we wanting more fluid things? And what sort of influences, I guess, should be taken into account? I mean, I would say that, a country's democratic will should come above most considerations. But here we are having a conversation sort of questioning that, right? And I almost wonder, like, what is the correct context in which to think about this? Because I also sort of just reflexively I'm sort of against the Trump border wall, just by how it's been branded internationally and what we understand as non-Americans and in the international audience, how we understand what we understand it to stand for. I stand against. But actually, when you think of what you just said, Philip, about how this was a democratically decided project, then I don't know. I'm not sure which side of the fence, so to speak, to fall on this.
I was just going to add briefly, go back a few statements, was that the kind of like, this isn't a protection against like sort of like caravans or like large mass like groups of people that are trying to flood the borders. But I think like that kind of description is what Trump and other advocates of the wall like use to talk to, advocate for it. So like, I think there's like some sort of, it's funny, it's like you don't often see like Trump isn't like showing images of the wall, but he is giving these like very grandiose descriptions of these like mobs of people that are coming in, which like none of it sort of exists. So there is this kind of, I don't know, just a kind of like mental image that maybe is from like the Great Wall, where we could imagine these massive like sort of battles of people like trying to like infiltrate, that Trump is like picking up on through his own rhetoric and like kind of using that as a scare tactic or manipulation tool. But, when you actually look at the things, when you see the photos of this fence versus like this kind of like large infrastructural sort of monumental wall, it becomes quite obvious, I guess. So it's a lot about, yeah.
No, I think like, I mean, I understand that was a democratic will, but the problem is that that the wall in itself, the function doesn't work, because it is not, that would not contain maybe or protect the US. So I think the problem is not that they decided to do it, but this whole thing became like a mega sign of that goes beyond protecting the US. So if it was the democratic will of only protection, it would be a different story. But it has been more than that. I mean, function doesn't even matter. It's like,
yeah, exactly. I feel like it's kind of I think in terms of functioning as a memorialized, materialized symbol that stands for a certain kind of American ideology today, it serves that purpose. It might not serve as a functional divide. It may not keep people in or out, or might not make us feel protected, but it definitely make us feel divided. And for a certain type of American ideology, this, because it exists in real space and it has, well, I'm confused here because I don't really know which one is the finalized selection of design. But if that design has a strong physical presence and can exist as a symbol for that ideology, then I think it's very, very dangerous. I don't know if at any given time in the history of China, maybe some people feel, oh, maybe we should live all together and welcome outsiders, and maybe all of this is just the government's propaganda make us believe that the outsiders are dangerous and we need to be protected. But no matter what that narrative is what we're made to believe in. The irony is that as a country, the U.S. has a choice. The government is literally set up to function this way. So I think in today's context, this is just particularly sad because if you're talking about, and I think another interesting thing I just realized, if you go back to the map of China, clearly, that orange and red lines are different phases of the wall. And that it exists like that primarily because of the natural topography of the country as well. Most of the, because it's a civil defense system, it has these watching towers and very intricate layers of military strategy, both in between and on either side of the wall. They naturally want to build it on top of hills. It's just like you see in some of the pictures. But clearly, if you look at the border of China today, it doesn't follow the wall. It actually expands much further north. So it is, I believe that is still like the purpose of these grand civil projects and the image that exists in the country and I guess the civilians' life is a collective story that we tell ourselves, and it is what is made to believe in. So yeah, I just realized that and kind of scared me for a little bit. Yeah.
We have also the chat where people can add comments as you're listening, because we have a bigger group today. One thing I wanted to kind of add to the conversation is this idea of settler colonialism. I'm from Pakistan, which is a former colony of the British Empire. For 200 years, the British ruled, and when they left, India was divided and the borders were created, and certain parts of it has fencing. And when you actually travel across the border, you see so many similarities between Indians and Pakistanis. But the border exists because it's a way to drum up support for politicians and a way to have a national identity. And it's interesting because when I came to the United States, I was like, this can't be a colonial place, because I'm coming to America. But then I realized that this place existed long before America was created, and that the native people were actually pushed off of their lands to create space for the settlers, settler colonial people. And that project involves a rewriting of history. To start history from the point zero is when the settlers arrive, and everything before that is erased, right? So we also have to, when we look at these flows of migration of people flowing across the planet due to whether it's climate change or political strife, we have to think about property, we have to think about ownership, we have to think about colonial histories, and we have to think about entitlement. Like who belongs, who doesn't belong, and is that really set in stone, right? Or is it more fluid? So those are some of the things I think about, especially in response to Philip, as you're saying, like these outsiders are coming in to take what is ours, this kind of feeling like, if we think about the future of the planet, is that something that's really sustainable? And what happens when you yourself get locked in by a barrier that you have created, right? What happens when COVID is worse in the United States than it is in China, or it is somewhere else in the world? And then you're not able to escape because you built a prison around yourself, So in an increasingly globalized world where, people are connecting on the internet, like how do we contend with the shared physical planet that we all live on?
But I wonder if your response is something that's not democracy. Because of course I agree with everything you're saying, right? I believe in more fluid borders. I believe in like more fluid kind of interchange of ideas and people. But if it's the will of the people in America to build a wall, and all of us Ivy League or MARC New Yorkers, whatever, believe it's not, like, should there be an elite group of architects, on Zoom who decide the future of the country, or should that be the will of the people through a democratic process?
I think that when you talk about the will of the people, you have to understand that Trump was elected by the Electoral College.
Right.
A slightly skewed system, right?
Sure.
And was created so that a lot of Black people in the South could not have a say in the elections. It was created so that the winner-take-all system of the states is designed so that and for many, many decades, they actually lined up, the popular vote and the Electoral College, but then it didn't. And so where do we go from here? And what happens when the United States, due to stuff that has already happened, the demographics change and the popular opinion shifts, certain things are inevitable. How do we prepare for that? And instead of thinking about it in an adversarial or from a scarcity perspective, like how can we think about more creatively about how issues of labor, like all of these things can be reconciled so that, I don't know.
But I think that project then becomes convincing 61 million people or 60 million people or 55 million people that that's the choice that's in their best interest as Americans. Like that's the project. And the project is to make a symbol that can communicate something as equally as persuasive as this like stupid wall that doesn't do anything, that can reach 61 million people who are not on Zoom, who don't have a master's degree, who think in different terms, but who have real political power. Like that should be the project then.
So the question then becomes, what is the role of the designer? What is the role of the architect in forming values, essentially, right? What does it mean when the head of the AIA, Architectural Institute of America, when Trump gets elected, writes a letter on behalf of all of its members saying, we support you and we look forward to all of the infrastructural changes that are coming, including presumably the wall, right? And then he got a huge backlash from the community who were like, no, we don't actually support this. How do we, as arbiters of cultural taste, how do we begin to talk about design and shift the cultural values that are upheld in society?
Can I just, I think Philip I appreciate the exploration of the devil's advocate argument, because I think, I guess I would add on to just a question for everyone of what you think, whether or not it should be a federal decision, or is this, is the wall of, if it is considered architecture of some type, something that is regional and should relate to the site, and should the people who are making the decision be the people that actually live every day, and people cross the border to go to school from like the border between Mexico and Texas. Tons of people go to McAllen like every day for school or for work. So there is this sort of whole community that exists on both sides. And then should people in Washington, or should people in like places that don't have that heritage really, or that border, be like are they involved in this process, and like why are we allowing it to be a national issue versus a regional issue or a cultural issue that sort of we should take charge on if we are kind of from that region. But I just want to hear what people think on that.
Yeah.
Has anybody lived near the border? I know, Beatrice, you mentioned, and Hannah, you have as well, right?
I guess in Texas and northern Mexico.
Yeah, currently I'm like 15 minutes away from the San Diego-Tijuana border. And I spent a lot of time in the summers growing up here between both places because I have family on both sides. I mean, I do think having like more regional decisions, it's definitely, I guess, a more democratic approach. Still though, for me, it's like this wall is essentially a symbol. To somebody else's earlier point, I think it was Pulane's point of how functional is this wall actually. I don't have the statistics, but I do have family members who are or were once undocumented and friends who are once or are undocumented. And I can promise you nobody jumped over the wall. There are many different ways to staying in this country. And also I think a big point that we haven't really touched on is we use this broad word of immigration when a lot of the people who are crossing the southern border are in fact refugees. And after living a few years in New York, the idea of what an immigrant is in New York can often be very different to the refugees that are crossing the southern border. A lot of my friends in New York are immigrants, but they're coming, from backgrounds where their parents are professors and they have money and they've had this great life in their other countries, and they're simply coming to the United States for more opportunities. And that's so different than people who are genuinely risking their lives for access to education, for access to healthcare, for access to be able to feed their families. And again, to the comparison to the Great Wall of China, I mean, the Great Wall of China was built to protect, for military protection. And I think it was Andy in the comments that mentioned Trump kind of demonizing Mexicans as being criminals and being rapists. And essentially that's what they're trying to do by like trying to convince the American people that this is like a military wall to protect us, when in fact it's like, this is not a military invasion. It's very different because we're having refugees seeking to enter the country, and it's not people coming in to attack us.
Yeah, that's a really important distinction. Thank you, Beatrice.
I guess what I was sort of thinking about when I was trying to, make us think that perhaps this is a more site-specific issue is that, again, like it's being co-opted as this like national agenda, and there's this like fake narrative being created about who Mexicans are that is like not coming from Mexico, or from like there's so many Mexican Americans on both sides of the border and people that have mixed heritage of like here. So it's strange that we're sort of it's this narrative that someone in Washington knows what's right for this place or this site that I think is and it's like national federal agencies that are in charge of this. It's I don't know. I mean, there are also racist people on the border in Arizona and elsewhere too, but yeah.
Well, who is designing, like, I'm looking at these, 8 wall fragments here. Like,
yeah,
somebody's doing this.
It's the Department of Homeland Security and the DOD. Trump has diverted, I think, $10 billion in funds from the DOD to work on this border wall, which is.
But
yeah.
are they engineers or are they like architects? Like
contractors,
yeah,
federal
yeah.
contractors who this gets bid out to, and then they just go and they do their job, and they try to, I guess, visualize or physicalize the descriptions that Trump has been giving, which are all over the place. Like, it's going to be really strong. It's going to be transparent. It'll be see-through. It'll be beautiful. And so all of that is, you are seeing that kind of physicalized in these mock-ups here. Yeah. I do want to talk about, I mean, I think that, Philip, it's really useful to think carefully about, the other perspective and being the devil's advocate. And so I want to think about like strategies of how do we deal with that, you know, we look back to history, what happened in Nazi Germany was a result ostensibly of populist, you know, democratic process. And I'm sure that the world will be faced with more such situations going forward. So how do we, yeah, like, how do we contend with that?
But isn't the answer just to vote for people and to gain political power and support those who aren't racist, who aren't white supremacist, and to make sure that they hold the majority in all branches of government? Like, that's, like, yeah. I mean, look, I think I'm playing devil's advocate in terms of just like trying to articulate it. I obviously don't support Trump or the wall or white supremacists who do, right? Like, but we should then, why is it that the country cannot elect politicians who are able to articulate an agenda that are not that? Why is it that there are enough politicians in Congress, in the White House, who are able to articulate this agenda if that's not the public will, right? And sure, if it's 3% here, 2% there, like, but there is like 40%, 35%, I'm not sympathizing with them, but the project should be to convince them that that the way that they elect politicians and the politicians' agendas are misguided. Like,
yeah, I mean, a product has been sold by a salesman and people have bought the product because he did a really good job at selling it, at painting the picture, at stoking fear, whatever techniques were used. And so I guess we have to first decode that, and then we have to think about, like, how do we, you know, on a massive level, shift what is essentially acceptable and what is desirable. And it's the creation, like capitalism in a way is the creation of desire so that people will buy things, right? And this is one of the things that people have bought into. So I also want to invite anybody who's in the chat, if you want to turn on your microphone and or camera and share your perspective, you're very welcome to do so.
Reading the chats here.
Yeah, sorry, I just wanted to say, yeah, it's a very frustrating idea that like we're supposed to somehow be sympathizing with, or like to try to adopt the perspective of these racist motherfuckers. Like, fuck them, you know, like they don't belong in the narrative of this country. Like no amount of scarcity mentality that says that, oh, you should be afraid of Mexicans, you should be so afraid of caravans. And that frankly, people rejected that in 2018. Hopefully they'll reject that this year as well. So I don't believe it's ever acceptable to sort of, you know, try to adopt their perspective and try to reason with that idea that somehow like, oh, because something has been taken away from them, something they should be afraid of, like this mass of people that's going to invade the country. Therefore, we should build the border wall. Like that is like frankly unacceptable. Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Thanks, Andy.
Yeah, I also think, like, I mean, the context of this conversation, like, to what extent lies our power as architects in this future, right? If we, I mean, this is a reality we're living in. If we're going to collectively through our daily lives and whenever we get an opportunity to build or reject a project, to usher in a new kind of change, really to what extent is our power as a profession, as an individual, as many liberals living in New York, as people who have different perspectives and different lives here and elsewhere. I can't help but feel like sometimes not doing something, like turning down a project, or sometimes voicing your opinion against your own profession, like the AIA sometimes is a very powerful way of exercising that power, but it might not be enough. That's where I think like the voices that we provided today, where your daily work might be, might never be symbolized and memorialized in a architectural project, but it is equally, if not more important, because it brings in the daily work that might bring up, you know, bigger change in the near future. Yeah, I think the real work is invisible. The real work might never become, you know, a tourist attraction or on a postcard. Just throw in a little bit of like idiosyncratic, you know, childhood memory there. When we were children, literally every single fall, instead of like going upstate to pick apples, we just go to the Great Walls for a hike. I don't think children of this country will ever go to the southern border and have a hike as part of their education. We don't have to worry about that. But what we really should be worrying about is what is our power in bringing change, and how can we translate that into our daily work.
But Nikki, that's what the Berlin Wall was. Like, people could never imagine that it would ever become like a tourist spot, right? Like, can we not imagine that maybe like there are no more national borders, and that one day people are going to the former US-Mexico border wall as a tourist, to just see, you know, read about history and how people used to have these like hateful ideas?
I think that's really optimistic.
Yeah, I mean, I mean, as someone who frequently crosses borders everywhere, I don't think a country's border is ever going to disappear, but it will exist in different forms and formats. And as a border management tool, I don't think, you know, the fence makes any sense, but a certain type of zone, whether that is a physical, you know, manifested landscape with facilities, or a combination with, you know, digital devices, and which is software kind of control. I sort of got to start somewhere. The kind of, the idea of the zone, I think, is perhaps a possibility. So if we reimagine borders of countries, and there might be a type of architecture that facilitates like connections and just like this trend. I do believe it might not be a threshold, but it is going to be a transition zone, right? So how do we translate that spatial concept is going to...
I was going to say, I think like maybe part of the issue here is that architects and designers really are kind of like a little bit removed from, it's like the same sort of issue when we like are driving around the city and see all these like massive, you know, constructions that are so ugly. And we're like, how does this get built? Like, how did this happen? It's because like we're not really needed to build a wall, to build a fence. Like, I think like reinserting ourselves as designers into the conversation somehow needs to happen before we could, you know, influence anything, unfortunately. I mean, the most important thing we could do now is like vote, right? And like perhaps like use our talents to like advocate for that, or you know what I mean? But like in terms of like, I don't know if like a speculative project about like reimagining the border, like though, you know, produces interesting conversation, is like a real solution at this point. And I think it's just because
it puts an image in your mind. And I'll point to, everybody should go to Philip's website to see a building that recently burned down in Chinatown, and Philip did these speculative visions of what that might look like, right? And even if that particular thing doesn't get built, like, you know, it gets lodged in your mind. It's like the Donald Trump image of like the caravan that doesn't exist, but you know.
Yeah, I think I'm being a bit pessimistic, but
yeah, I think to the analogy of the Berlin Wall, I think its power lies not in the wall, is the physical wall itself, but lies the lack of like the act that is something that isn't that is an iconography you can change by literally, tearing it down. So the remain becomes a symbol of, reconnection and freedom. I think that reimagination and the alteration of the narrative is important. And by design, I think we do have that power.
I think also, besides becoming a tourist destination, I think I would not discard the possibility of the American war preventing Americans to escape the country as well. I mean, it could work the opposite way as well. Yeah.
Absolutely. I feel like we're like really on the brink of some really bizarre times in US history, and it's pretty scary.
So someone should build a speculative wall to the Canadian border to prevent Americans from going to the better country.
Yeah, exactly.
There's going to be a wall between the red and blue states if Trump wins in whatever 2 weeks.
So on that note, I wanted to ask everybody, how do these two projects, one kind of historical and one more contemporary, make you feel? And after that, we have a quick round, a lighthearted round of quick questions to kind of conclude the conversation.
Should we do the same order?
Sure.
Check in again. All right. Hannah, we'll give you a few seconds to formulate a thought. How do you feel?
I think, I'm more familiar with the US-Mexico border, but reading a little bit more about the Great Wall of China, I think it's interesting because it's an example in which for me, I'm asking this question, is architecture, physical architecture, still like a symbol of power in today's world, or is it internet and virtual space? And if we are architects of built environments, how can we still play a role in that kind of dialogue and conversation about power and who kind of claims it online? So that's my thought.
So, I mean, there is the question was, how does the wall make me feel? So there's a saying by an ex-president of Mexico, Porfirio Diaz, who said, poor Mexico, so far from God, but very close to United States. So I think both countries have benefited throughout history in many, many, many ways. And I think we should somehow concentrate on that instead of like separating, for sure. But there has always been this strange competition between United States and Mexico, I mean, since history. But also the vice versa. So I think we should concentrate on that.
Thank you. Nikki?
I first came to the US for higher education when I was 17. It was a decision, made by me, but supported by my family, because they think that if I feel I will get better education and access to what I want to learn here, I should have that choice. China let me go, and the US welcomed my decision with scholarship, and thus opened my new chapter. I have officially lived in the US more than I have in China, but I do feel that the power dynamic of the two countries has somehow escalated extremely, like in the recent years. I wish that this really bizarre, obsession of this presidency over China could be translated to something more productive and more positive by the people who actually live here. Yeah, I hope the future will be a little bit better than this year, because it's a really strange year too. I don't think I don't think, I'm ultimately not optimistic because I believe all designers are optimistic. So you have to believe in a better future and to identify like what you can do better today. But yeah, I just hope like this like strange obsession of China versus the US could like be translated to something better.
Beatrice.
Obviously, I have strong feelings against the southern border wall. I mean, I think ultimately it just is a symbol of hate. But it's more than anything, it's embarrassing. I think that's the word I would have to describe it as, because let's say if the southern border was built like the Great Wall of China, I think that would be terrifying and intimidating to see such like a massive structure. But the way it's currently built, I can only describe it as embarrassing. And what you guys were mentioning of it being a tourist attraction in the future, I'm like, the only way I can imagine other people wanting to see this wall is to come like laugh at the United States. But that's just the only way I can imagine it in the future.
Pulane.
I don't know, this conversation makes me feel like as designers, as architects, as cultural influences, we really do need to interrogate why this wall is so appealing to so many people, why the forces of xenophobia and racism have made it such a, I mean, I think after Make America Great Again, Build the Wall is like Trump's second like best known slogan. And so I think, honestly, I think if we're going to influence the conversation and if we're going to influence the way that nations and states and regions and so on develop, we really do need to understand sort of the sociological aspects of cultural forces. And I personally feel like, you know, all of the illustrious schools that we attended, I wonder how many of them actually had like a sociological or an anthropological aspect to looking at design. And that's something that's really interesting and important to me, especially in terms of like decolonization and things like that. And yeah, I don't know, I just think we need to think more about how culture influences people and vice versa, and our role in that, as opposed to just thinking we know better than 62 million people, for instance, in the United States, and how they see this project. I'm sure that a lot of Trump supporters would call us, like you said, you know, liberal elites, and probably wouldn't care about our opinions on this issue. And I think that's also another really interesting problem of why is that? Why is there such a big divide between people like us and, you know, who I think for the most part don't support this wall, and the people that do support it. And I'm just not sure how to have those. I mean, this is obviously one great forum in which we're having discussions like this, but I find that in our industry, people aren't having these discussions. And I think that's really the only way we're going to move forward. So this conversation makes me optimistic, but in terms of how the industry in general takes on conversations like this, like I think it was Bakas, you mentioned what the AIA president did in relation to the election. Those sorts of disparities between what practitioners and maybe what the heads of the industries think, and you know, the circles that they move in, and their financial and I think maybe ego, you know, aspirations, like how all of that sort of human nature, sociological stuff, how does that affect the way we build? How does that affect what we design? I don't know what the answer is, but I think we're not going to reach it until we start asking questions like that.
Philip.
Yeah, wow, that was great, Pulane. Yeah, I think maybe to build off of that a little bit, I feel a little bit optimistic in a twisted way, because even the racist xenophobes that Andy was talking about need something physical. And I guess as designers or architects, we are the ones who build physical things. And even though these forces are kind of much larger than any single architect or any single group or whatever, like architecture is important because it does make physical things for real people in real life. And even, I mean, for liberals in New York and also like everyone else, or everyone who voted for Trump, they still care about physical things, and they still feel like physical things mean something in their lives, even if they actually don't, like as in the case of the wall.
Thank you. Mark, how do you feel about the two projects, or one of them?
I mean, I'm just, for months, like the last few months leading up to this election, I struggle so much like understanding the logics of Trump supporters and of Trump. So I think like I'm just, I don't know, there was like a report this week that like, what was it, 545 children have still not been reunited with their parents. It's just like so upsetting. And to me, it's just like, does like half of the, like, how does one person do this to a country? One, how does he influence, like, whatever, if the voter, you know, people voted for him, but like Andy's saying, I mean, he lies constantly, he uses rhetoric, fear, like all these things to convince people, but it's just like the kind of like lack of empathy that is symbolized through this like construction of the wall just sort of astounds me. Like I can't understand it. And I think like that's how I feel whenever I think about these things. It's just like a total lack of like, I cannot understand how this makes sense to some people. Yeah.
Yeah, I just want to quickly respond to that. That's my daily struggle too, but I feel really we can't, if we think about like Trump as a character, as a symbol as well to a ideology and a party that support these projects, just like the wall, we can't let that be a distraction to the real movement that needs our attention, because we can, if we let the showmanship, if we let this narrative of the wall distract us and make like I feel like we spend so much energy trying to make sense out of these things that it could be like a dangerous like distraction.
Yeah. I guess it's just like me trying to comprehend it as a way of then using that sort of logic to reach people on the other side. Like I think it's just like so divided, and I've had conversations with, you know, Trump supporters, and there's just there's like no point of, I cannot find a point of access to like engage in any sort of like constructive conversation. And I wonder how we can get that. I don't know.
Yeah. And I'll just add that, you know, I don't have any kids, but when I was younger, when I was just about to enter middle school, we had this late night program at my school, and my youngest sister also came along, and there are like two very dark, very large grounds you have to walk through before you get to the exit after it's all done. And when we got to the exit, we realized she was missing. And there was a similar story that Joy Behar told recently on The View.
Oh, I love The View. Sorry. Okay.
Yeah, she's great. And our hearts just sank. You know, that feeling I can never forget, to have your family member be suddenly missing. And then everybody's running all around. The lights have been turned on the swimming pool to see if she like fell in and drowned or whatever. And, you know, we found her after 15 minutes, but that was one of the worst moments of my life. And I can't imagine what it must be like when you have left your home, you're only carrying the stuff that you're able to carry physically, going through tons of hardships to escape a bad situation, and then to have your kids be taken away, right? And to me, that is embarrassing. It's, as somebody who became an American last year, it's, I feel ashamed, I feel embarrassed because I pay taxes in a country, I identify with the values of a country that's not living up to those values. And it's because of the people who are in charge right now. And I think that even though the wall is A, kind of non-existent, B, non-functional, it is a symbol, and it is something that is used to rally people to agree to those kinds of things. Like when you turn people into like an other, almost an non-human, you know, thing in the imagination of large numbers of people, then you're able to get away with stuff like that, right? So that to me is like really concerning. Yeah, it's really sad. But
I feel like, or maybe just to add on to that, I feel like isometric is very good at kind of telling those stories, right? Like that's kind of through design or through graphic design. Isometric is really good at kind of telling these stories that are not in the typical narrative.
we try. Yeah, we try.
There's like a power to it, like also through photography, etc. Like that should be the project.
Yeah, so we try. I think we're all doing it in some way or another, you know, by having conversations, by making images, by making messaging, by making architecture. So we're gonna shift the mood and end on a lighthearted, hopefully more fun note, because we have to stay resilient. We have to keep the energy up regardless of what's going on. So Mark will lead the Q&A.
Come on down. It's so funny. Do you watch The View? I watch it. I watch it religiously. I can't get enough. Like Joy Behar, like screaming, like about everything is like just exactly my mood, and I can't get enough of it. I didn't realize that. Okay, we're gonna start a lightning round of really fun either or questions, and we ask that everybody just sort of. Well, I guess there's a lot of us this week, but you know, why not? Everybody turn your mics on and just say your answer to this or that question. You could also chat it. I'll count down to 3. So the first one is tall or wide? Tall or wide? 1, 2, 3. Wide.
Tall.
Tall. Who said tall? Okay. Any brief explanation? No?
Because you can see more.
You can see more. That's good. Okay, the next one is open or closed. Open or closed. These are kind of, you know, a bit obvious. Okay, open or closed. 1, 2, 3.
Open.
Open.
Yeah, everything's closed these days.
There are no supporters here, it seems.
What?
Sounds like there are no Trump supporters here.
I know. I know. They're like just like trying to weed them out. Left or right? Left or right? 1, 2, 3.
Left.
These are silly questions. All right. Land or sea? Land or by sea? By land or by sea? 1, 2, 3. I think sea. I like the water. Cool. Okay. And then these just kind of go off to a weird. Handwrite or type? Handwrite or type? 1, 2, 3.
Handwrite.
Yeah.
I still type with 2 fingers. It's really not good. Okay, salty or sweet? Salty or sweet? 1, 2, 3.
Sweet.
Sweet. I was recently actually telling somebody that my cravings have gone from like fatty, salty to like a sweet tooth in this like quarantine. I don't know if it's That's what it is. Okay, and then the last question is a bit ominous, but it's 2020 or 2021?
Oof.
Dun, dun, dun. 1, 2, 3.
2021.
2021? Really? I'm a
I
bit
said
worried.
2020. So
Yeah.
that hopefully it will be over. When does this end? I think 2020 would be a good end year for all of this.
Yeah, hopefully.
Yeah, I just heard this morning some new information about this ending, like the third or last quarter of 2021 in the US. I was like, oh my God, what does that even mean?
Yeah,
One per year.
it's going to be so strange to, at some point, hopefully, be able to just go out and do something on a whim and not have to like plan and dress a certain way to protect yourself. Anyways, so that concludes the lightning round. I hope everybody is, lifts up their spirits a little bit and enough to at least vote, those of us that are able to here. And thanks everybody for joining. This was an interesting conversation.
Thank you, everybody.
Yeah.
Really appreciate it.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Okay.
fun to
We'll
meet
check
you
in
all.
after the election. All right.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
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 Bye.